Hello, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome back to my stream. In this video, I'm going to be somewhat departing from the series that I've been doing for the past couple of weeks on, sort of institutionally re-engineering the government, undertaking that task. Today, I want to focus on a more specific and targeted issue. An issue both social and fiscal, and that is the issue of immigration, right? So the common argument, so the left is very in support, very pro-immigration, and the common argument on the right is that immigrants take jobs when they come over from real Americans, right? From Americans, and that job displacement causes unemployment among Americans, or at least makes it difficult for them to obtain a job when needed. More difficult. And so this economic argument against immigration on the basis of job displacement, I'll call it, taking jobs from Americans, immigrants coming over and then taking jobs from Americans, or taking a job that would have gone to an American. I think that this is the common rhetorical point made on the right, and I think that it's not a bad argument. It's not a bad argument for being anti, or either anti-immigration or pro-constrained immigration. And I would say that I'm pro-immigration, but I'm pro-immigration within limits, right? I'm for reasonable constraints or quotas upon immigration, and I'm in favor of there being standards for who should be able to enter the country, who should be able to gain citizenship, and I'm in favor of those constraints, because I think that that the argument presented on the right, for being limited. For limited immigration or tighter immigration standards, it's not a bad argument, but I think it's one that we have to, on the left, we have to reckon with, and respond to as candidly and intelligently as possible. So I think in this video, I'm just making a very simple statement. I'm going to consult my notes because I do have a number of points to make as to why I would be pro-immigration with limits. So I think I'm going to make a case for being pro-immigration with limits, and it's going to be a very short video and a very simple case, hopefully one that causes people to further cogitate the issue and think about it a little more critically. So I think I am pro-immigration with limits because I think immigrants add economic value. I think that in bringing in certain types of immigrants from certain places and with certain skill sets and certain motivations and needs, we can supply workers. We could supply labor, right, in certain for certain industries that are in need of it, right. Specifically, I think, especially in California, or where there is a lot of agricultural work, I think that Hispanic immigrants, for one, who primarily have background in agricultural work, this may or may not be a stereotype, but nonetheless, let's assume that this is a valid reality. I think that immigrants of that type and for that specific industry obviously add economic value, because what's the retort on the left is that these immigrants are doing jobs that Americans wouldn't want to do anyway. And they're willing to do these jobs, and because of that, they're more able to do these jobs. And so they supply. I think that that's probably true, depending on what the evidence might suggest either way. Evidence presented by the left and the right. I think in general, what these types of immigrants in these categories could do is supply labor that is needed in certain low-skill industries, in these agricultural industries that require the need, that have a need for agricultural workers, that Americans probably are willing to do if desperate, but these jobs are just perhaps more amicable to these types of immigrants because it's what they're used to, and it's the background they come from, the cultural background, the economic background they come from. It's something they're more used to than certain American workers who are used to jobs in air-conditioned spaces, let's put it. So regardless, I think that even if it is true that bringing that the logical consequence of bringing in more immigrants is that jobs that would be gained by Americans actually go to immigrants, and so there's a certain amount of job displacement among Americans as the result of immigration. I think that there's a very simple way to respond to that argument, and it's to say that, well, okay, if it's the case that a logical consequence of greater immigration is greater job displacement among Americans, then simply limit the number of immigrants that you accept, that you let in, that you let cross the borders for either work or citizenship. The natural response to that, and the best and most clear-cut response to that, okay, sure, a logical consequence of immigration is job displacement among Americans, fine. Then limit the number of immigrants you let in, you limit the number of jobs displaced, the number of Americans displaced, the number of jobs that go to immigrants rather than Americans. Okay, so that's a very simple response to that. I think that it's obvious that we can be pro-immigration with constraints, on the basis that there will be a certain amount of, as a logical consequence of immigration, a certain amount of Americans, that are displaced because jobs are going to immigrants rather than Americans. If that's the case, then simply limit the number of immigrants that you let in per cycle, and you can limit that economic impact, that temporary increase in unemployment among Americans. Now remember, there are usually plenty of job opportunities anyway. So and people are never applying to just one job. They're applying to many different jobs at the same time. They may not get that job, but they'll probably get another if there's a large supply of jobs that are available. So you just simply limit the impact, the negative impact of immigration by moderating the number of immigrants that you take in, so that we can have the benefits that immigrant workers provide. On a citizenship track, we can have the economic benefits while limiting the costs. One of the costs being job displacement among Americans, who when jobs go to immigrants rather than an American. So that's how you'd respond to that. Now, here's the thing that we need to raise when people say, I'm not anti-immigration, but I'm more in favor of a constrained immigration scheme, because immigrants come over and they take jobs, from real hardworking Americans. The thing with that, another way to respond to that argument is to say, well, Americans actually displace each other for jobs all the time, right? Multiple people, Americans, are going to be responding for the same job, or are going to be applying for the same job. When that job goes to one of those Americans and doesn't go to the others, then that American, right, has displaced the other Americans from getting that job, right? So Americans are constantly displacing each other for jobs all the time. Americans are constantly competing with other Americans, and I guess the way that you'd construct that response in this debate is to simply say, well, yeah, I mean, sure, what's going to happen when you let in immigrants is jobs are going to go to them rather than real Americans. You simply respond to that by saying Americans are competing with each other for jobs all the time. Americans are displacing each other for jobs all the time. And so what difference does it really make if we constrain the load of immigrants coming in? What difference does it make, really, in the long term, in the grand scheme of things, if an American is displaced by an immigrant rather than another American, which happens 100% of the time in the job market. So that's another way to respond to it. And my final argument for being pro-immigration but with limits is to say that, based on the economic outlook of things, we'd have to look closer at the numbers. But it could be the case that for each working person, for each person in need of a job, you actually have more than one job available. You actually have, multiples of jobs that are available. If it's the case that there are multiple jobs per working person, we will always have room in the job market for immigrants, because mathematically, if there are 3-4 jobs available per person, every American is going to be able to find a job, and letting in. Of course, that's not always the case, because there's an inherent chaos in how individuals fall into certain paths and get certain jobs, and this is kind of a surface level argument, but at least is good within a debate setting. That if it's the case, based on the numbers and based on the numbers in the job market, that we actually have, for each working person, unemployed working person, for each working person, we actually have, 3-4 jobs available. Mathematically, it will always be the case that we have some excess in supply that could be consumed by incoming immigrants. So that's another point to make. The key idea is that, taking all of these things into consideration, I would say that it's probably wiser, to be pro-immigration, but supporting limits on immigration, because there's an inherent chaos introduced into the system when you're simply injecting more people, more individuals, more agents into the populace. There's an inherent, and it especially touches upon the economic dynamics of things. They're going to be they're not only going to be consuming jobs, but they're going to be taking from the supply of houses. They're going to be taking from the supply of food. They're going to be taking from the supply of water. They're going to be taking from the supply of a number of other precious, limited resources or constrained resources. So the chaos, the sort of chaos that is always introduced into the economic system by an influx of new participants, or new consumers, is something to consider, and that's why it most certainly should be, borders should be closed. Well, borders should be neither totally closed nor totally open, right? The borders in that sense, I might say, should neither be open or closed as in a door. They should be cracked open, right? They should be open a certain length and width, so that only those, so that we constrain the influx. And I think that that's what the right and conservatives are trying to communicate, is that it's just there's that inherent chaos introduced into the system when there are more consumers consuming a limited or constrained supply of resources. Either it's jobs, could be any number of things, as I pointed out. So I agree with that, and I agree with that sentiment. But in general, I think immigration, if we can limit its negatives, limit its impact, the impact that occurs when more agents, consumers, and workers enter an economic system, if we can figure out, how we can, if we can figure out what the proper limits are, so that we can, get the benefits of new incoming immigration while limiting its costs, is important. And I guess the 3 points I make is, to the idea that a logical consequence of immigration is job displacement among Americans, jobs not going to Americans that need them, as opposed to, immigrants who could get jobs in their native countries. I would say, it touches upon ultimately what is a good point or a good sentiment. It comes, I think, from a good place and an intelligent place, but we just have to remember that, it's all about the numbers. And when it comes to the negative impacts of new incoming immigrants, the you know if we can all agree that there is a negative impact, as there is a positive and negative with anything, we can at least say, okay, well then if there is a cost, they bring benefits, but if there's a cost, we simply limit the number of immigrants to increase the benefits and decrease the costs. The other point is that, when people say immigrants are going to be taking jobs and displacing Americans, we need to make the point that, Americans are displacing each other for jobs all the time. They're competing with each other for jobs all the time. What difference does it make that the job that you could have gotten goes to an immigrant or an American? When you're applying for multiple jobs at one time, you may not get that one, but if you're applying for multiple jobs at one time and you're properly skilled and have the proper background for the job, it ultimately doesn't make a significant difference. And the last point, of course, is that if we do live in a world, responding to this argument against immigration, if we do live in a world where there are indeed multiple jobs, per person that needs a job, per working person, then that mathematically means that it mathematically means that there will always be some excess supply of jobs that the immigrants could consume, right? We obviously want to maximize the excess supply of jobs to ensure that no American is without a job, but we certainly have some room, to let more immigrants in and have them consume some of that excess supply. Otherwise, where is it going? Remember that it's not only people that need jobs, it's employers that need people. And if there's this excess supply of jobs, it's beneficial, right, to those employers. So if we're looking on the other side of this, sure, more immigration, right? Immigrants displacing Americans for jobs, causing some temporary unemployment among Americans in the short term. If we live in a world where there are always multiple jobs per working person, there's always going to be some excess supply of jobs. And when we have that, that's actually a bad thing, right? It's a good thing to a certain point, but it's actually a bad thing, because if we have this excess supply of jobs and no one to work those jobs, that's a bad thing, because these employers actually need people who will work these jobs. And so to a certain extent, that excess supply of jobs is a good thing, but ultimately it proves to be a bad thing, because we tend to look at this issue from the perspective of a person needing a job and not getting one. We don't look at it from the perspective of an employer needing a employee and not being able to find one, right? So if we have to examine both sides of that dynamic. And if we can, we realize that, if there are multiple jobs per working person, there'll be this excess supply of jobs, which is actually a bad thing, because that means that employers are without employees who will work those jobs. That hurts the economy. So in that way, we can bring in immigrants to consume that excess supply of jobs to ensure that these employers who need people to work and can't find them actually do have people, who will work those jobs. So we have to look at it from that angle as well. Other than that, those are the central points that I wanted to make, and just to examine, one part of the argument that's being made, and to try to present as many good points as possible against this argument that's being presented against immigration by default. Again, I think that the argument that being sort of anti-immigration because they're going to come, we should prioritize the needs of Americans over immigrants. I take that point, but I think that there are limitations to the point based on some real-world realities that I've pointed out. What about the needs of, so the argument, they're going to take jobs that Americans need. What about the needs of employers who need workers that they can't find? And those are equally important. So that's where I'll end. Hopefully you enjoyed this video. Hopefully you have some thoughts, and it's just my basis for being, pro-immigration, but with limits attuned and calibrated to maximize the benefits of immigration while reducing its costs. Thank you for watching.